The study guide that you have in your hand says the title of today's message, Faith That Pleases God. The title is about the only thing in this study guide that I will assure you will stay the same. I do want to share from the text this morning that we have, and this will help Daniel. He can rest back. Daniel preaching from the book of Daniel. How about that? Daniel's running the system this morning. The question came to me this week. How has my faith changed me? And I might ask you that question. How has your faith changed your life? If you're saved, then your faith certainly changed your life when you got saved. You now see things from a different perspective than you did when you were lost. Some of you might have gotten saved when you were children and have grown up all of your life. You can remember being in church, or being a part of a church, or you can remember the time when you gave your heart to the Lord. And maybe you were not guilty of a lot of things as a child. But as you grew through your life, as you went through life, how many things did you abstain from because you were saved? And you knew that for you to do those things or to be a part of those things would hinder your witness as a Christian. How many of you have had your life changed from the standpoint of the desires of your heart? What you really want, what you really long for? Well, the kind of faith that pleases God is the kind of faith that changes our life. We can never be the same when we've come to really trust in and lean on the Lord. To trust Him for everything that we have in our life. I've often told the story, and probably have told it here several times, of times in our life, in our ministry, when we did not receive a salary, when all of our sustenance came from our trust in the Lord and watching God provide for the needs that we had. My life has never been the same since that happened back in the 70s. And we've always learned to trust in the Lord, no matter what the circumstances, no matter how bad it may look or how bad it may seem. Things around us may be falling apart. But the child of God standing in faith, having confidence that God will deliver us from those things that are destroying the people around us. Trusting in God means that we have abandoned our resources and we're trusting in Him. Understanding that we cannot possibly deal with all the problems that we have in life in our own strength. Whether it's sickness or finances or relationship, whatever it may be in our life that's causing us difficulty, we can be sure that God has a purpose for allowing those things to be taking place in our life. And if we can rest in that assurance, then we can also understand how we can tolerate certain conditions or situations as we go through those circumstances in our life. The Lord never promised us that we wouldn't have problems. What He has promised us is that He will go through them with us. He has never told us that He would deliver us from those problems, but He has told us that He will deliver us through those problems. He will provide when we trust. Now, our text this morning that we have in the study guide for you comes from Daniel chapter 3 and beginning at verse 15 through 18. But go back with me to the beginning of the book. Looking at those first 3 chapters in Daniel, the first chapters before this one, we find some circumstances that we actually could take these and apply them in our day. If you notice the first verse of chapter 1 tells about Nebuchadnezzar coming and and coming into Judea, into Jerusalem, and taking captive all of the Hebrew children, all of the Jewish people. He took them captive and made them captive in his population in the Babylonian army, or the Babylonian people. Now, in this incident, God is using a pagan man to accomplish his task. God will often use the unsaved to do the job that he wants done, because the saved person may not sit in that position or be in that place of authority. So here in this incident, God wants something to take place in the life of the Hebrew people, and he wants to eventually bring them to the place where they are restored to their kingdom and where they have all the promises fulfilled in their life that God intended them to have. So if you read through the first chapter, you'll find that captivity taking place, how that God separated, the Lord separated people out according to Nebuchadnezzar's desires. He set some in places of leadership, choosing those who were perhaps of the elite, maybe those who were better educated for whatever reason. The choices were made, and so they were set apart to be a particular place of leadership that others might follow them. Chapter 2, we find Nebuchadnezzar having a dream. And he called in all of his wise men, all of the soothsayers that he had in his group, said, interpret this dream for you. The strange thing was, he said, I can't tell you what it was. I can't tell you what I dreamed, but if you'll interpret it for me, you'll be rewarded. Well, of course, they couldn't interpret the dream. But one came to him and said, well, there is one who might be able to interpret that dream for you. He's one of the Hebrews that has been brought here, and his name is Daniel. And you bring him, and tell him what you can of the dream, and he'll be able to interpret for you, perhaps. And so those things happened. Daniel did interpret the dream, and the interpretation of that dream is found in chapter 2. And now we move into chapter 3. And in chapter 3, we find Nebuchadnezzar, thinking himself to be such a mighty person that he is the head of all the nations, the king of all the lands. Now he is a mighty warrior, erects a monument to himself, builds a monument, and through that building of that monument, he desires that all the people bow down and worship him. So beginning in with verse 15 of the 3rd chapter, he says, now if you are ready, at the time you hear the sound of the horn, of the flute, of the harp, the lyre, of the psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you will fall down and you will worship the image. That was the image that he created for himself, which I have made. If you fall down and worship the image that I've made, good, he says. But if you do not worship, then you shall be immediately cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God that will deliver you from my hands? And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said, O king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you. We don't have to think about this because we already have the answer. If that's the case, if God allows us to be thrown into the furnace, if that be the case, then our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hands, O king. But if not, then let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, small g, by the way, in most of the Bibles, nor will we worship the golden image which you've set before us. So of the elite Hebrew children, or Hebrews that have been brought into the land of Babylonia, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, friends of Daniel's, had been separated from all the rest. And you remember Daniel refused to eat the meats that was offered and wanted to be eating just the vegetables. And these three were joining with him. And they proved God's provision because they came out healthier and stronger than the others who had been eating all the meat. So that's not to say, by the way, that you need to be a vegetarian. It's just, that's where God put them at that time. And so in this case, these three friends of his, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, stood before the king, and the king had said to them, "Now when the music sounds, I want you to bow down and worship this idol." And they let it be known that they could not do that. They would not do that because they were trusting in their God. And as they made that commitment to say to Nebuchadnezzar, we're willing to put our lives on the line. We're going to trust God to deliver us. And Nebuchadnezzar made fun of them, said, if you do not bow down, then I'm going to throw you into the fire, or have you thrown into the fire, into the furnace, so that your life will be taken. Well, that didn't faze them. They said, well, if that be the case, if we get thrown into the fire and our lives are taken, so be it. We still will trust in God. Now, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6 tells us what we need to know about faith pertaining to our walk. He says, but without faith, it is impossible to please God. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So that's God's desire for us, described for us by the writer of Hebrews in the New Testament. An example of that found in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, with the 3 Hebrew children who were cast into that fiery furnace. Now, Daniel chapter 3, verse 23 and through 25 says, and these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound. Remember that word. They fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. The word bound simply means they had their hands tied, their feet tied. They were not free to move around. And then the king Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. After they had been cast into the fire, he was astonished, and he rose in haste and he spoke, and saying to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? And they answered and said to the king, true, O king. Look, he answered, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like to the Son of God. Now, some people take this story as a type of mythical storytelling out of the Old Testament. In reality, in this moment, in Nebuchadnezzar's life, it was the change that took place in him that would change the history of the Babylonian Empire for a period. When he saw the 3 Hebrew children that had been cast into the fiery furnace, he raised the heat of it when he knew they were going to be cast in. He raised the heat of it up 7 times as though to destroy them instantly, because if he was going to punish them, he would have just lowered the heat down and made them suffer through it miserably. But instead, he turned the heat up 7 times, so much so that those who cast them into the fire were actually destroyed themselves. And when he went over to look into the fire himself, he probably was singed a little bit. But when he saw the miracle that had taken place inside, he said, there are 4 in there now. And you need to remember this. No matter the circumstances you're going through in your life, if you're a child of God, there are 2 of you going through it at the same time. You will never walk through the fiery trials of your life alone if you're living for the Lord. Now, here's a strange principle found in the midst of these words. The only thing that came off of these men when they were put into the fiery furnace was what man had put on them. What was that? They bound their hands with ropes. They tied their feet with ropes. But now he sees them walking around, which means the ropes were now gone. The only thing that's burnt off was what man had put on them. The only thing that you lose when you live your life by faith, or you go through a life of trials and difficulty, the only thing you're going to lose is what man has put on you. You may choose that for yourself, But if you go through the trials as God takes us through those trials and testing us for us to understand our commitment or lack of commitment to Him, whatever happens, it is for God's good, God's glory, and for our good. And so they witnessed all of these things. He witnessed all these things that happened, testified to the governors or counselors standing around him, said, now there are 4 in there, and the 4th one looks like the Son of God. He saw Jesus. In that instant, this old, ungodly, heretical king saw Jesus. Else, how would he have known that he looked like the Son of God? God did a miracle. Not only did he break the bonds off of the 3 Hebrew children and free them, but he also brought a revelation to the heart and to the mind of King Nebuchadnezzar, who in that instant saw the Son of God. What a story. Look what happened. He goes on to tell us, and Nebuchadnezzar, in verse 28, and Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angels and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Look at this testimony. Whatever you're going through, whatever this church goes through, it is for others to see what God can do. Folks are already hearing about what happened Tuesday night. I have received no less than 5 communications from people who were, at one time, faithful, dedicated members of this church. And their word has been, we don't know what's going on, but it's obvious God is doing something. That kind of a witness will turn a church around, and it'll turn a community's attitude toward that church around, and it will cause people to look and say, see what God's doing. Not what a man, a preacher, or a people, but see what God's doing. Here, Nebuchadnezzar looked into that fiery furnace. He saw the 3 Hebrew children alive walking around. The 4th was in there, so much so that he came out and he offered this decree. If anybody says anything negative against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they'll lose their life. For theirs is the God who delivered. He sent his angels, he said, and delivered them from the fiery furnace. What could God do with your life or mine if we abandoned our purposes and turned all of it over to God? If we just trusted in Him, would man see what kind of a difference God has made in your life if you really trusted Him? I'll never forget the first time I went back to my hometown to preach. A whole bunch of people came out from my high school. They wanted to see what Carl Marshall had going on now. Because see, when I was in high school, I wasn't a Christian. When I left high school, I had been saved, but I was not living for the Lord. And all they knew about me was all those negative things. They wanted to see what I was up to. And so they came to hear me preach. The wonderful thing is, after a few years, some of those people actually came to know the Lord and became a part of the church that I pastored in my hometown. You see, God wants to use whatever you're going through to His glory. So, what kind of faith pleases God? Well, the first thing, faith has to be reckless. When I resigned my salary, Mark was in middle school, I think. Carla was in grammar school. Several years later, many years later, Mark had a chance to speak somewhere in my presence and say something about me. And he said, my dad has a kind of crazy faith. That's one of the greatest compliments he's ever paid me. A great, crazy faith. A faith that's willing to put everything on the line. Now, that's not me. God allowed me to do that. God led me to that. And through that, God made some changes in my life, and I think in the life of my family. So it has to be reckless. These 3 Hebrew children stood up against the king, actually mocked him, made fun of him, and turned against his word, wouldn't do what he said. Sometimes you have to do that. We're living in a society that can't make up its mind whether kids are born male or female. We're living in a day when we got people that are wanting to rule over our nation who can't decide what bathroom they're supposed to go to. We live in a strange day. I'm telling you, it's different than anything I've ever lived in. And in this day, I will guarantee you, you've got to be willing to take a stand, and that stand is not always going to be popular. If you stand for God, I assure you, you'll stand against this world, because the world that we live in is coming apart. It's a sacrificial faith. The scripture tells us in Romans chapter 12, verse 11, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. Now that doesn't mean go out here and take our life, but it means that we sacrifice our life to Him so that He is the one who gives direction to our life. It's the yielding of ourselves. And then he goes on to say in that same passage, a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So we're challenged in this passage to renew our faith, to renew our mind before God, so that He can work through us in the sacrificial offering of ourselves unto the Lord. And then the last thing that I'll mention, this faith is a righteous faith. The kind of faith that pleases God is the kind of faith that comes from us when we have committed ourselves to Him, surrendered our minds to Him, and that He is able to work through our minds and do those things which are acceptable unto Him. An interesting thing about being a Christian, if you're saved, you know you're saved because when those temptations come, something is telling you no. And when we have to question whether we should or shouldn't do something, I believe it's always safe to not do it when God is giving that direction in our life. So, it is a faith that will not compromise. I don't know about you, but I've lost a few acquaintances that I used to call friends because I wouldn't compromise my faith. I wouldn't compromise what God had called me to live in my life. The world will constantly pull against you to do all that it can to destroy you, to take you down, but you have to make a choice, and that choice is to not compromise your faith, your commitment to God and His will and purpose for your life. Trials come. You know, one of the most unique verses in the Bible, Proverbs 17:3. Listen to what this says. The refining pot is for silver. Now, you know that if you want to get pure silver, you burn all of the impurities out of it. And that's always done through a smelting pot. The furnace is for gold. The furnace blasts away until the gold comes out pure. It actually liquefies. But look what it says, the last part of that verse. But the Lord tests the heart. The furnace is the refining of silver, or the refining of silver. A refining pot is for silver, and the furnace for gold. But the Lord, He tests your hearts. One last passage. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 5. Who are kept by the power of God through faith. Who are those that are kept by God through faith for salvation, ready to be revealed in the last day? In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if indeed be, you have been grieved by various trials. I think all of us could identify with that part of this passage. That the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise and honor and glory and to the revelation of Jesus Christ, whom, having not seen, you love, though now you do not see him, yet believing, yet rejoicing with joy inexpressible, full of glory, receiving the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. So, what kind of faith pleases God? Dedicated, committed, surrendered, yielding, letting God live his life through us. Hebrews 13, 5 and 6 says, let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have, for he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Isn't that a great promise? It doesn't matter the valleys we go through, he's always with us. That's why the psalmist could write the psalm that he did. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Whatever you're going through, God goes through it with you. It may be for the refining of your soul. It may be for the testimony to others, but it is never going to be lost if we live trusting him.